Welcome everyone to this week's episode of the Indian Doctor podcast. I am joined by a guest. As you can see, Karan is not here. So he left me. He couldn't spare an hour a week, but if you recognize the reference, drop me a comment. So this week I'm joined by a guest. He is actually my fufur. For those who don't understand, fufur means uncle. He's related to me from my wife's Sanskrit side. His name is Sukwinder Singh Bassi. He is a historian and author. He specializes in military and social history and has written a book about Sikhs, in particular during the First World War. His book is titled Thousands of Heroes Have Arisen, and it is available to be bought today. Check out the info in the podcast title to find out more about how to buy his book. But first of all, Fufur, Suk, I'm going to call you Fufur throughout, just a reference. How you doing? Are you okay?
I'm fine, thank you, Indy. Yeah. I'm calling you Indy, yeah? Is that right?
Yeah, you can call me Indy.
I prefer you call me
in-law, but I don't mind. Okay, everything's available.
Call me Suk. Suk, I think is better, but it's up to you.
How you doing? Is everything?
I'm
okay?
fine. I'm fine. Yeah. I'm a man of leisure at the moment, so this is a good time to have me on a podcast.
Good. I'm glad I caught you at a good time.
Yeah.
So obviously, Sanj put me on to the fact that you've written this book, and she bought a copy. I've been reading through it myself. And it's a sort of take that I've not sort of heard from kind of anywhere, really. To give people a bit of background on the book, do you want to just let them know how you came around doing the book and what the inspiration was behind it?
Yeah, probably about 10 years ago now, 2013, 9 years ago. My son was coming up to going to secondary school, and we just happened to go on this tour. And it's a tour I can recommend to everybody. It's like the sort of battlefields tour of World War I in northern France and Belgium.
Okay.
So we went there, and there's a couple of monuments there, which I'll tell you the names of. One's the Indian Memorial, a place called Neuve-Chapelle, which is in France, and another place is called the Menin Gate, which is in Belgium.
Yeah.
Now, when we went there, we didn't really expect to find many Indian or Sikh things that in these monuments, but there were hundreds, if not thousands, and some of the names on these pillars, basically people, especially in Belgium, who didn't survive the war and had never even found their bodies. Some of those people had the same name as my son, and we picked up on that. Yeah, so Amar Singh, there was many Amar Singhs on the pillars.
Mm-hmm.
So it was just a shock to me because it wasn't something I'd really known about. Our family has a connection to the Second World War, but the First World War isn't really something that I knew too much about. So that mixed in with the conversation with my mum, where she said that her grandfather, who's my great grandfather, would have been a soldier. And in terms of the dates and times, it would have been a First World War soldier. He just said to me that I've got this. It's the right time. My son's at the right age. My daughter's at the right age of learning stuff about their history and their culture.
Yeah.
And I just thought to myself, well, why don't I do something about this? They're not gonna know about this. No one's going to teach them in schools about this. And I just wanted to know as much as I could about these people who'd come, thousands of miles across the planet, to fight a war, and which I knew nothing about. Who were my own people? They were my own community.
It's true. I mean, I was sitting there thinking, we all know, I think we're all well versed on the Second World War participation that Sikhs had. So to give you a background on my side, my papa fought in the Second World War. He got sent home early because he broke his leg playing football. But yeah, that's a story for another day. As a reward for his service, he was given land, and that land has been split amongst my dad, my taya, and my chacha. So they treasure that land. They never want to lose it or anything because it's their last sort of piece of their dad. So that's why the war is such a big deal. My mum's got the medals at home from the services that he took place in and whatnot. I've got the pictures as well of him and his own crew. I guess you call him.
Yeah.
And yeah, my dad's very, very proud of it, and so is my mum. And I knew that from an early age, but I didn't know that we participated in the First World War. So this was news to me when I saw this. It's not, as you said, it's not spoken about or lauded, and then it seems like you sort of stumbled upon it by chance, really.
Yeah, very much so. And I think it was just there was a centenary of the First World War coming up in 2014, so people have been talking about it, and I just thought to myself, there is an Indian connection here which I wasn't aware of, and let me go out and find out as much as I could. And I had, it was, what's what I'm looking for, it was like I had the gusto, I had the push to go and do it. So, I did basically. Yeah.
And that push took you down this pathway to write the book. So obviously you've seen all these names on the pillars and whatnot. What did you do afterwards?
So after I came back, I started to do some research, and what I wanted to do, and I'm not, I'm not a trained historian, so I'm not educated. I haven't got a degree in history or anything like that. I was just an enthusiast, really. So, but what I did know about was how to do some research. So I went to the British Library, and what I found was a huge collection of translated letters, which were sent to and from Indian soldiers during the First World War, and they were translated letters from a censorship, and so censorship obviously are, they're quite common in military circles. So what they do is to make sure that the kind of soldiers are not writing home telling people military tactics, that type of stuff, and also it was a good way of keeping their eye on them to understand what they're thinking about during their participation in the war.
And there's no uprising or anything being planned behind their back
or
whatnot.
Things like that. Yeah,
People thought social media networks are bad. No. This is way before that, right? This
definitely.
This is live in the flesh. I'm going to read your letters.
Yeah, definitely. So, so there's a really large archive there. There's 26 bound volumes, and there's thousands of extracts, which were translated into the English. Now, what's been preserved?
Someone had already done the translations for you.
So they were translated originally by either a combination of the censorship team at that time, British censorship team who had Indian members, or what used to be maybe the sort of officer of that particular regiment. It tended eventually to be the censorship team, and there were quite a few people who effectively diverted the letters sent to and from these soldiers to them. They would then read them,
right,
and they were trained. If even the British ones were trained, the head censors were trained in what they described as the native languages. So in the case of the Sikh soldiers, I've written in Gurmukhi, which is the language of the Guru Granth Sahib, or they were written in Urdu, which was the language of the British Indian Army in the Punjab. So they then were able to translate them because they were trained in those languages. Even some of the British soldiers who were on the censorship team were trained in those languages, so they were able to translate them quite well into English. And then, so obviously for me, that was a stroke of luck. So we had a huge volume or database, basically, of letters sent to and from Indian soldiers as well as Sikh soldiers on the Western Front in English, which then I could obviously examine.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty big data set to work with off the bat. That must be super helpful. The bit that makes me think is it's surprising that the British were so able to find other Indians to help them participate in reading their own counterparts' letters.
Yeah.
And I was like, why would you want to do that? Obviously, there must have been some sort of monetary payment on their side that they're getting off it. But it made me sit and think, this sounds a little bit twisted because you're essentially snitching on your own people.
Yeah. I think for any empire to control a set of people, you need what you might describe as people on their side or collaborators.
Yeah.
When these people were, they joined the army, they had these skills, they were probably paid for those skills. So they were just taking advantage of the employment that were available to them, really.
Yeah.
And where I was very lucky was that the British Empire at the time, they effectively broke down the different, I'm trying to think of the right word, the different communities, for want of a better word, in India. And actually at the top of each of these letters, which were translated English, it told us which community it came from. So, for example, in the Sikh letters, it says at the top quite clearly, from a Sikh, for example. So then,
why would it say that?
They had these theories. They were called, so from probably the late 19th century, so 1870s onward, to until 1947, they had a way of dividing the Indian people into what they call martial races, or the
Yeah.
soldiers, should I say, into martial races. And effectively, I mean, in language of modern times, they basically split people up by their what they describe as community, religion, caste, and effectively big them up to say, you guys are the best thing since sliced bread. And
Right.
that was being done on a continuous basis for many, many years. For by the time the First World War came about, for example, the British had controlled the Punjab and their soldiery for 60 years. That's 6 decades. And we're not
Right.
talking at the time where there's telephones and things like that. They had complete control of information.
Mm.
So they were able to effectively mold these soldiers into what they wanted them to be.
Why would they want to split them up by like religion, caste, etc.? What I'm assuming they tried to create some kind of hierarchy. Is that the
Yes,
word? Or some
effectively,
sense of
yeah.
importance or power?
Yeah, effectively. And also by splitting them up by the different religions and in some religions' cases by caste as well, they were able to keep their caste rules. So, for example, if it was a Muslim regiment, they would get, halal meat, that type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So that then these, and one thing to remember is a lot of these soldiers who were in the army before and then joined subsequently during the war were
Yeah.
poor. Firstly, they were poor. Secondly, they were also illiterate. So they were going to a place where they felt at home. All their comforts would have been looked after for their particular community. And in that way, they engendered a lot of loyalty. So a lot of people always wonder, why do these people fight for the British? Well, they engendered loyalty through many, many different means, and that was one of them.
Mm. When it comes to the whole caste thing, it's kind of weird how this whole like power complex has been built back then, and people still kind of cling on to it today. And there's
Yeah.
still that thing seen within Sikhism, and it's just funny how that was embedded in them years ago, and then people still laud that as like a thing to be proud of today. And I don't think people know that that's one of the potential origins of it, really, in terms of creating this hierarchy or whatever. That's one of the places it came from. I think if people knew that, they probably stop talking about it in such high terms.
So one of the things that speaking about what you just said was the different regiments. Some regiments had different platoons or companies within them, which would be religiously specific. In the Sikh regiments, they tended to go for what they call Jat Sikhs. I'm not 100% sure why they particularly picked that community. Maybe because of numbers, maybe because of the historical significance of who they felt they were. They obviously knew about Sikh history. They knew about the Sikh religion. I'll probably go into that maybe in another question.
Mm-hmm.
But then they then effectively, as you said, they promoted and those particular castes to be into those regiments. So particular regiments would be known for being Jat Sikh regiments, and they'd get them to do particular pieces of work and particular pieces of soldiery, and also in the actual community itself. They'd get them to do important jobs, such as they used to build these. They built these what they called canal colonies, and they would want Jat Sikhs to go and do those things, and then those Jat Sikhs would then inherit that land or start working that land, and that actually a lot of that land now is in Pakistan, but they were called. Those canal colonies were something again. They wanted Jat Sikhs to do because of their farming history as well. Again, promoting them to be something distinct, and nationalizing that particular community.
Wow, that's quite surprising, but you can see why there's power within it, because I'm assuming in Punjab, in a place that's full of Jat, aka farmers, there's obviously going to be a bigger proportion of them to pick from than say other castes, and they're probably more likely to be willing to go to war because they're in a rural area and they haven't seen, I'm assuming, much of Punjab, let alone the world. So they're thinking it's an opportunity to go and see different things, whether it's in unforeseen circumstances. It's a chance to get out there and just try something out, as bad as it sounds. But it kind of gave him an out. I think you've mentioned this in a few of your letters, saying how a lot of them were just in awe of the things that they'd seen because they'd literally left the motherland and they were able to go and just see other parts of the world.
Yeah, no, very much so. And there was also, I mean, I'll mention it now, in case I don't mention it before. During the Raj period, Well, 1860 to about
When
1947.
you say the Raj period, so the British Raj, what does that actually mean? Because we're going to be referencing it a little bit throughout this.
Yeah, so the British Raj, when I talk about that, I mean sort of the coverage of what they call British India, so controlling what they call British India, which is today, excuse me, Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, and actually Burma as well. It was all in one place, one area. They had joined arrived on the Indian subcontinent probably late 1600s in the Bengal, and slowly but surely through war, through treaties, they
Yeah.
effectively started taking over the majority of India, if not everything. Um, and by the time they came to the Punjab, that was the last part of India from my memory that they took over, and they would have taken over in about 1849. So quite late, if you consider things like the earliest battles in for Bengal were 100 years before that.
Is
So
that because in Punjab it was the highest place to crack?
multiple reasons. Apart from it was hard, it was going to be hard. They were also had a strong government. They had a strong king. As you probably heard of Maharaja Ranjit Singh.
Yeah.
They obviously had a strong king, and they basically bided their time until Maharaja Ranjit Singh died, and then after that there was a bit of chaos in the sort of court of Lahore, and then they took they bided their time, and then they started fighting with them then, and effectively over a 5-year period, approximately 1845 to 1849 from memory, they were able to defeat the Sikhs over two very hard fought wars. And that was actually one of the reasons that they put Sikhs up as one of the martial races, because they had two very difficult wars against them, and actually for the first time maybe on the Indian subcontinent they actually came close to losing.
Right.
But that was a surprise for them. That was tough for them to understand. But what they did give them was the impetus to then find out why did these guys give us the hardest fight, or a very hard fight? Why were they able to fight us to a point where we may have lost, although eventually they didn't. So it was very important for them to understand the Sikh psyche, the Sikh way of life, and things like that.
And what did they learn from those things of looking into the Sikh psyche? Was it just that we're like a warrior race? We don't really tend to give up.
Yeah, I think they, what we'd call it nowadays, I think you'd probably call it sort of racial profiling, or it was a gathering of every type of information that we could about this particular group of people, and it started from religion. So they had a person come over from England who then sort of wrote a huge volume, six volume piece around the Sikh religion. You may have come across it. It's called Macauliffe. It's by someone called Macauliffe. It's called the Sikh religion, and the idea not necessarily being to understand the Sikh religion and think, oh, that's something nice, more to do with how can we use this for our benefit. And they did. They were able to manipulate some of the text to make it sound as if the master may be the British Empire rather than what we might describe as God. So they were able to they tried to use religious texts for their own benefit against the Sikhs.
Oh, so they tried to change the wording of it to make it seem like it was,
or the interpretation of it, I'd say. So it was very clever. So, for example, if you have the word the master, the master could have been changed. It could have been interpreted as the British, because we are now your masters.
Right, I see.
For example, I didn't go too much into that in the book, but there was a huge push into trying to effectively manipulate people.
There was, I noticed that in your introduction, as you said.
Yeah, because you can't control this many people with only a few British people there.
And it did seem that there were offsprings happening of people converting to be Christian, people shifting away from Sikhi into other faiths, because it was just being watered down a little bit. And it seems like they were ahead of their time. I mean, they understood fake news before everybody else did. Yeah, and they just pushed out the narrative, and people bought into it because they had no other source of checking things, and they thought, okay, this is how life is. You may as well accept it.
Yeah. So these have resulted in these investigations or data collection all resulted in the creation of handbooks. And these handbooks were given to European recruiting officers, and then they'd have a perfect, well, not perfect, a very strong understanding of what the Sikh culture was about, what the people did, what they ate, how they tied their turbans, what kind of swords they used, what months they went to, plow the fields, when was harvest, what festivals they had. They knew all of this stuff. The best time to go to the villages to recruit, this type of stuff. I mean, the one of them handbook was written in 1900, is 200 pages long, and it's only just about Sikhs. Recruiting handbook, Sikhs, 200 pages.
Is that still available anywhere?
You could probably find it on Google somewhere. There's two. There was one. I think the author was called Bingley, and the other one was Falcon. And I mean, I've accessed both of them, but I think I probably found them online, or if not, I found them in the British Library, because they tend to have copies of. I think one of them they've got in the British Library. So this is how they got people to fight for them. I mean, the other side of it is that there were also families had been soldiers for many centuries. Way back to Ranjit Singh's army, before that in Guru Gobind Singh's army, these families had been historically
had this big
soldiers.
tradition of fighting and always being a part of, like, stand up for your country, etc., or just
or stand up for your people, stand up against tyranny. And and when the British took over, some of these families still wanted to be soldiers. They wanted to carry on their traditions, and the only way to do that was to join the British Army. Some of them were proud of that. That I did this because it was my family tradition, and it's all I knew. And you can't really blame people for that.
No, I don't blame them at all. I think they sort of just saw an opportunity and they thought, well, this is how life is. I myself can't change it. I've just got to go with it, and I still want the opportunity to carry on the family tradition, which obviously is a big thing back then, because pride and following through, and if your dad's done it and your granddad's done it, you really want to carry on on that route, don't you? You don't want to let the family down or bring shame to the family. All these traditional factors really start coming through and shining through.
There were also people at the time who didn't want to be part of this, and they didn't want necessarily be soldiers. They saw opportunities in other countries, and there's quite a significant exodus of Sikh people from the Punjab during the 1860 to 1947 period. So
where did they tend to go?
They started going to Asia first. So to the west, and places like China, and other British colonies, Malaysia, Singapore, this type of thing, and then eventually getting to China, and then eventually making their way to the west coast of the United States and Canada.
Wow!
So you've probably heard of a ship called the Komagata Maru.
I haven't
come across that. Okay, so it was basically a ship which sailed to Canada with approximately 340 Sikhs out of 376 passengers, who thought they were subjects of the British Empire and would feel welcome by coming into Canada, but they weren't. They were effectively turned around. It's quite a bit of violence. There was a bit of a standoff, and sent back to India. But those guys, those Sikh men, and they were all men, from memory. They were your first, British Columbian, Sikhs. Where there's
they were the first settlers.
They were the first, or attempted settlers, definitely, and I'm sure some of their relatives and that came back again. Sometimes you see pictures in Gurdwara where there's a sort of there's a harbour with some Sikh people being shot, and that is actually those people that got off the Komagata Maru when they got back to India. Quite a few were killed on the harbour because the British were obviously waiting for them. Many of other of those passengers, went back to the Punjab, were put under house arrest for the rest of the war. So those guys really, had it tough.
So were those guys escaping India? Basically, they weren't allowed to go. They were just escaping. They tried to escape to go to Canada, got sent back, and then they were killed upon arrival. And
some of them were killed upon arrival. Yeah, I think about 19 were killed on arrival. The rest of a lot of them were then put under house arrest. In America at that time, they had some other Sikh people who'd got there who had created what we might call a rebellion, and they were under the sort of title of the Ghadar Party, which you may or may not have heard of.
I have, yeah.
Yeah. Similarly, they thought this was a great time to get the British out of India.
Yeah,
and they created they wanted to create a rebellion, and they got back. A lot of them got back into India, and they wanted to, especially the Sikh troops, they wanted to make them rebel. Unfortunately, they got found out because one of them sort of turned coat, and the British knew that they were going to come, and a lot of them got arrested, and many of them got hanged. At that time, that was probably 1915. So there was, so the story is very nuanced of the people of the Punjab. It
wasn't just let's toe the line. There seemed to be some sort of pushback, some rebellion.
Definitely.
And it seems like the way that they kept people from not rebelling was to form these divisions, as you said, amongst caste, religion, and just give people their own power structure, because they knew if everybody bands together, there's more of them and less of us. It's kind of a thing that in society people don't understand. If you gather in masses on one thing and you all have the sole aim and you put your differences aside, you can be really powerful and effective.
Yeah,
but
definitely.
Everyone preys on your insecurities or your problems, and then they just make you have issues with each other basically and cause conflict.
Yeah, no, definitely. And the other thing I'd say is about information flow. So one of the main ways of obviously sharing information back in the day were newspapers. So newspapers, there were scores of newspapers available in the Punjab, all again very communal and community based. So Muslim newspapers, Hindu newspapers, Sikh newspapers, English, Punjabi, Urdu newspapers, and the way they controlled that was that they controlled the editors. So you couldn't literally, as an editor of one of these newspapers, write anything anti-British.
Wow.
It was all very pro-British, and even when they had things like sort of festivals like Guru Gobind Singh's birthday and stuff, they'd print articles with a British angle to those celebrations. So
how could you put a British angle on a Guru's birthday?
So they'd say things like, and you'll see in my book, there's a chapter called Loyalty, and it's a very nuanced sort of chapter. They'd say things like, using, as we mentioned earlier, some of the religious texts that the British were ordained to come, that they were, it was prophesized that they were going to come and the Sikhs were going to fight with them on their side, things like that. And if you think about it, if someone tells you a white lie, if it's said often enough and said for long enough,
that's the thing about lies.
Something becomes true, doesn't it?
Saying it, people start to believe it, and you start to believe it yourself.
Yeah, you'll see in the book. I think there's from memory. There's a Sikh soldier that says something like, "We want to, make big the name of Guru Gobind Singh under the British flag." He says something directly as that, and that's their understanding of the world that they live in. We spoke about earlier. How much do they actually know? And we're lucky because we're in a world where information is open and free. But they came from a world where they wouldn't know anything really, because they only know what they've been told and what they've been shown. And many of these were illiterate. Many of these new soldiers were illiterate.
No, of course. I mean, soldiers I'm assuming a lot of the soldiers back then were just trained to take orders, trained to just fight. They were not necessarily trained to think or to question things. So that can definitely play a big role in why the uptake was so high. I mean, this kind of leads to my next question, which is why was the Sikh uptake so high, considering they were a minority in India? I think you gave me a stat in the book, but obviously I will lean on you to sort of tell me the stat again. So
one of the things I've just taken a step back is prior to 1857. So 1857, there was an event called the Indian Mutiny. So the British call it the Indian Mutiny. Indian people call it the First War of Independence. And basically that's where people basically rebelled against the British. That was in northern India. So and and what basically happened was Punjabi regiments came to the British rescue. So Hindu, Sikh, and Muslim regiments came and fought on the British side, sometimes against even their own, religious fellows, and effectively defeated these rebels. So from that time onwards, the British started, apart from using the martial races theory, started effectively recruiting the majority of their soldiery from the Punjab because of these.
Okay.
So you'd see that a good proportion, a very high proportion of the British Army as at the beginning of the First World War, were Punjabi. So that's sort of an important point to note. In at the beginning of the war, the British Indian Army was about 20% Sikh, and that is significant. If you look at the whole population of India, which is very low, it's probably about 2%, but they made up 20% of the British Indian Army in 1914. But that was much more to do with the fact that they were Punjabi. So the majority of the army at that time were Punjabi, and the Sikhs obviously made up even a smaller percentage there, but still made up a bit more of that sort of overall percentage in the overall British Army.
And during the first period of the World War, the first Indian Independence War, why did Northern India come to Britain's aid? Because Northern India hadn't been conquered at that point.
Yeah, no, it had, and only strange enough, only 8 years after the Punjab had fallen.
Sorry, yeah, I'm getting my dates mixed up. Yeah,
and I'm not an authority on that, but I'm assuming that they'd been national. Punjabi people. At that time, I would say, and you'll notice from the letters, there was no sense of Indianness.
Mm-hmm.
There was a sense of Punjabiness. Not sort of Bengaliness, but not necessarily Indianness. So they didn't necessarily think they were fighting against their own countrymen, because effectively they felt that that was their country was a different country. Effectively, that the Punjab was a different place. We know it as colloquially as all that's all India. But at that time, they didn't really have a national sort of understanding of nationality, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
that could be a driving factor, I would say.
So Sikhs make up this massive amount, the 20%. Where are they then deployed? So in which parts of the war are they utilized in?
So generally, when people think about the First World War, they think about the Western Front, and that is that's
in all the history books we taught at school. So yeah.
And the Indian Army was there. Again, we spoke about that earlier. That was a bit of a surprise for us that they were there. About a million, maybe 1.2 million at the highest total Indian soldiers fought in World War One.
Mm-hmm.
And the largest deployment actually was in a place called Mesopotamia, which is modern day Iraq. So Iraq actually, and many of the Middle East, some of the Middle East countries actually came into existence after World War One, because that was the disintegration of what was the Ottoman Empire. So apart from fighting Germany in World War One, the British and the Allies were also fighting Turkey, the Ottoman Empire.
Mm-hmm.
So that was out of those million, a good 600,000 Indian soldiers, and obviously then thousands of Sikhs were fought in what was Mesopotamia and is now Iraq. They also fought in many other places: Egypt, Palestine, Africa, China, Gallipoli. So one of the things I think is really important in this discussion is that when people speak about World War One, they mention certain battles. So they mentioned, for example, the Somme battle. They mentioned the battles at Gallipoli and other Western Front battles. And what was really important for me is that people know that our people were there too. We don't have a sense of our Indian people and Sikh soldiers being in these battles. That's something that's really important, that we know that we were there too. Especially in places like the Somme. Somme was a very famous battle, one of the most bloody battles ever in human history. And to know that there were Sikh and Indian soldiers at that battle as well, who actually involved, so not standing at the side, but actually involved and fighting for a cause, I think is really important for people to know.
Yeah, thinking a lot of film or old film role that we tend to see of like Sikhs in the war, you do see them on the front line, whether it's marching with a gun in their hand, wearing their bugs and whatnot. So you do have that kind of visual aid to sort of help you see that. And that's important because a lot of people don't think that those exist, but they are out there. They're shown in various documentaries of some sort about empire. So it is definitely shown. And with regards to the letters you found, were they all from one area, or one area where all the Sikhs were pushed towards? Or did you find letters started around from all over the globe that were transcribed?
So the censorship that I was able to access was the French censorship. So
Okay.
this was and there were censorships all over the world. The only
Mhm.
one I was able to access, I actually accessed two. One was the Boulogne or French censorship. So this was the Western Front censorship. And there
Mhm.
was another one where I was able to access some letters in the Middle East from a place called Port Said, or Port Said, should I say. And that was a handwritten archive, which much more difficult to transcribe actually.
Yeah.
Um, but that was also only a particular year of the war, which was near the end. So they were quite interested in their own right, because these soldiers are coming to the end of the war, and they obviously their views had changed over the period of time. The ones on the Western Front, so we had letters coming to people on the Western Front from obviously their families and going from the Western Front, but there were also letters that were going to different those different arenas that I mentioned earlier. So someone, for
Okay.
example, who's fighting in Egypt was able to write a letter to someone who's fighting in France. So we
Because they
were able
probably
to,
knew each other.
yeah, same regiments, or historically same regiments, or family, same
Mm.
villages, that type of thing. And sometimes the person on the Western Front was getting a letter about their village, what's going on in their village, from this person who maybe have left India after them.
Mm.
Because you imagine these letters would go on boat. They would, they're not, flown home. There's
No,
no
it's not
airplanes.
quick.
No, there's no airplanes. No, there are some airplanes, but obviously war type airplanes. They're not commercial airlines at that time. And so some of these letters would get on boats and take months to get home, in both directions. Also going through censorship, probably 6 months by the time a letter gets home. Who knows? Some
Yeah,
of these
because
letters,
it might have been held. There might have been a bottleneck, maybe of people
yeah,
just reading the letters before they send them
yeah,
out.
and also some boats would get sunk. So by submarines, they had submarines then,
Yeah.
and those letters never even make it home. That's one of the things I always wanted to know, was that how did people find out that their son had died, and things like that, and they'd find out sometimes through the depots, through the regimental depots, but that would sometimes,
That's quite
and
grim, but yeah.
yeah, many occasions, many months or many weeks after the person actually died. So that must be quite tough news to find, to hear, should I say?
Yeah, I mean, imagine finding out that someone's died and then you get a letter from that dead person with a
Exactly.
bottleneck
Yeah.
somewhere that comes through. That
Yeah.
must be really brutal and difficult to find.
Yeah. Yeah. I think
Okay.
the other thing I was going to mention, we were talking about why they came forward. One of the things I always was concerned about was numbers. So you'll see in the book that each year the number of Sikh recruits increases.
Mhm.
And you'd think logically that people are coming back from the war, coming back from these different arenas of war, especially Mesopotamia, for example, because that was like the
Was that
1914.
relatively short?
That war went on the whole time. Actually, that went from
Right.
1914 to 1918, and that was in particular a very difficult campaign for many different reasons, and actually probably opposite to the Western Front. So the Western Front was cold, wet, trenches,
Yeah.
water, lice, freezing cold. But Mesopotamia was like the opposite. It was 120 degrees, heat stroke, and sand, dust, flies, everything. The worst. There is actually a letter that actually says that someone who had been on the Western Front and actually would want to prefer the Western Front to Mesopotamia in terms of a place to fight, because it's that bad. And yeah, so I was wondering, so why wouldn't people, people are coming back injured, legs shot off and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Why they're going back to their villages? People must see that this is, this is not bad, not good. Why are people still coming up to join? I always wondered that. And again, links back to our racial profiling, information collection. They apart from using those tactics, there were other tactics for recruitment. So I should mention, obviously, there were generational, families who wanted to fight, and they went on
Yeah.
their own
Yeah.
accord, and there were volunteers. There's no doubting that, but there was also coercive tactics used, and that runs throughout the Sikh letters that come
Which type
home.
of tactics?
So there was the Governor General, for example, of the Punjab at that time was somebody called Sir Michael O'Dwyer. Now you may know that name. He is the man who Udham Singh shot dead in London.
Yeah.
So he was the Governor General of the Punjab during the First World War, and he used to have these massive rallies, or darbars they were called at the time, but we'd call them rallies in modern times. And effectively, he used to shout stats at people. Your community's done this. That community's done more. You need to come forward. Your gurus said that you should fight with the British, that type of stuff. Using any tactic he could to get recruitment numbers up. That caste has done better than your caste. This area has done better than your area. That type of stuff. And that went out for years. That went on for years.
Comparing districts as well.
Yeah, comparing districts as well. And you'll see in my book, they actually were in the one of the appendix, it shows you they went down to district level and were able to tell you which districts were best for recruiting, and which were not. Where would we get recruits and where would we not? And that was another tactic they used. They also used village officials. So you probably heard the word zamindar and lumbardar. These like sort of officials or leaders of villages. Mm-hmm. And what they do, the deputy commissioners of these districts, they'd give them targets. So you need to get 15 quota is a good word. You need to get this many, people to come and sign up, or you're going to lose your post as the official of that village. And there's actually a letter in the book which I got, which is from a Sikh lumbardar, and he says, firstly, my whole family's just died, this guy, the deputy commissioner, is forcing me to get these recruits. I don't know where I'm going to get them from. And he's given me a date by which I used to get them.
I'm surprised they let that letter through, considering it speaks badly about the British Empire. That's
a really interesting point, actually. I think what happened at the beginning of the censorship, they were very strong. They even redacted names, so they wouldn't have the name on there. But later on, as things got more lax, they still recorded them. Some letters didn't get through, but these kind of letters did. They were where they were talking about troop movements and anything that's really would be detrimental to British pride. Maybe didn't get through. The letters do say whether they passed or not. The vast majority were passed and let through, but sometimes they may take out bits of them. What that has allowed us to do is to get the understanding of the feeling of the troops during this period, and obviously that was quite lucky for us. So they had the other two things I should mention. During the war years in the Punjab, there was a plague, which I think it went on between 1915 and 1916. So people were dying on the streets. It was like bubonic plague. That's the right word. And
bubonic plague.
People were trying to get away from that as well. They had higher grain prices as well. So not having an income. If you didn't have an income, your family's dying.
Yeah.
Although the Sikh soldiers and Indian soldiers weren't paid very well, it was still some
income. Yeah,
it was still some income. Yeah. So it's very nuanced. You'll hear very often that the British Indian Army or the Indian Sikh recruits were a volunteer army. There was a significant proportion, I'd say, that were volunteer, but I wouldn't say everybody was. And it wouldn't, to me, it wouldn't even make sense if they were. There must be something else going on. And I've mentioned, quite a few different, nuances as to what was going on in the Punjab. Effectively, were forced or coerced into, fighting for the British in many ways, in some cases. And it's actually, I should have mentioned, the British wrote an official chronicle of the Punjab in the war, and even the official British chronicler in that particular book said that when a recruiting sergeant was known to be coming to a village, that village would clear out for in a 5-mile radius. So they admitted in their own sort of version of events that recruiting wasn't straightforward as people think it was.
Was there ever a case where maybe others would sort of tread on another person's district just to make up numbers? I assume there was probably some sort of infighting amongst commanders or something.
I can imagine that happens. I know that there were some what they describe as nefarious tactics trying to get people. Not necessarily this example is a Sikhs example, but there were occasions where I noticed from a newspaper where that they'd even go after women to say, if you don't persuade your husband or your son to join, they'll go missing. and the people be kidnapped and stuff like that. There were a couple of examples which I found of that, where people expected other people to go missing because they would, their sons had gone missing, so they wouldn't get recruited.
So
So there were some tactics being used, definitely.
And why do you think there's sort of a lack of acknowledgement for the role that Sikhs played in the British actually winning the World War, or the First World War?
I think again, it's probably quite nuanced. I think historically, as I said, I didn't know nothing about it, and I thought I was interested in the subject, and I think that generally the victors write the stories, and the victors will like to write about
war
themselves.
Is always won by the winners, isn't it? Or the winners write history, or whichever the saying goes.
I think in the Indian and Sikh soldiers' particular example, the British forgot them because they were effectively they ruled them, and India forgot them because in their views, the historians' views maybe, that they were fighting for the imperial power and not for India, and so we're not really going to write about them.
But we still knew about World War II compared to World War One, and even in World War II, they were still fighting for the British, weren't they?
Yeah, true. I think the World War II thing is that there's people still alive, and it was in living memory.
Right.
And whereas, and obviously we've had independence since then. After the First World War, we still weren't independent. So I don't think people started writing about it because basically they didn't know too much about it, I think, or they felt that they weren't worth writing about at the time,
or they were not freely able to because they can't, and then only after independence were they then able to express their actual genuine opinions. That's
probably more correct. I think nowadays there's a lot more push in this country, at least, to acknowledge the role that Sikh soldiers and Indian soldiers played in World War One, especially during.
I think it's good, and I think it's necessary. I mean, that was acknowledged by the statue that's been put outside Smethwick Gurdwara in Birmingham. So that's sort of a mark towards it, saying this definitely happened. But I always thought that statue was because of World War II, not World War One. I'm not sure if it is a mix of both or like a commemoration to both of them. I'll need to go there and obviously look.
No, I need to do the same. I've seen pictures. It's a very nice statue, definitely.
It is. So why do you think it's not taught freely in schools about like just the colonial reign? I know it sort of loosely ties to this, but the colonial reign isn't really acknowledged with how far-reaching it went. Because as you mentioned, people would flee India. Well, Sikhs tried to flee India to go to other British ruling states because they didn't like how the state of affairs had become. So it just makes you think colonialism was such a big thing. Obviously, people used to rave about how great the British were in terms of ruling the waves and whatnot, and just more understanding and sort of acknowledgement towards that I think would be great for the British people to know, because a lot of people didn't know. I found out myself by luck when I went to university that all these things happened, and that's when I'm pretty much close to being a fully fledged adult.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think I looked at my son, obviously has done history at a certain level. And he at A level they did I felt some obscure stuff, which I didn't really know too much about. And I was thinking, well, actually, why are you not taught anything about colonial history? And it's just something they don't do. And as far as I'm aware, I mean, the history that I've done at my school, we never did anything. We may have mentioned the British Raj and something like that, but it was never going into any detail.
I had no mention of the British Raj at all. I mean, obviously, there's an age gap between me and you, so you may have heard brief parts of it. I don't remember hearing anything about it. All I remember hearing was just World War One and World War Two. Britain won, yay. Britain came to France's aid, yay. And that's it. That's pretty much all the big flashpoints I have. And you hear a lot about Hitler and Stalin.
Yeah, and the funny thing is that it's the colonial experience that actually binds us all together. So if you go to a school now in most major cities, the majority of the countries of origin of maybe the parents of the children are all something to do with the British Empire. And actually, if you taught that and you showed people where these connections come from, you'd understand that. People would have a better understanding of each other. And you get on a bit better.
No,
One of the ones that always, if I could tell a quick story, one of my West Indian friends was always talking to me about his goat curry when I was in my 20s, and I was like, okay,
yeah,
goat curry, yeah, okay. Just to me, it didn't mean anything. But when one day I ate around his house, and I ate it, and I was like, well, hold on, no, this is Indian. He goes, no, 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 it's from Jamaica or Trinidad. I said, no, no, this
yeah,
is Indian. I know what Indian food tastes like. It's Indian. And then when you read about it, the connections are all there. If you go to Trinidad, there's lots of Indian people. Go to Guyana, lots of Indian people. Because after slavery, a lot of Indian people, exited or left India on a system called indentured labor. And
right.
effectively, it was slavery in another name. Obviously, nothing as bad as slavery, but they had to pay their way. And when they got there, they realized they couldn't pay their way back. So effectively, they worked there for the British, and and their generations are still there now. And that's
And it's
how all this
crazy how
mixture.
things like that are happening at the moment with obviously the stadiums being built in Dubai, sorry, not in
Mm,
Dubai, in Qatar for the World Cup.
mm,
Similar kind of tactics. So you pay to go there,
yeah,
you get there, they take your passports away, and then you've got to pay to get them back, but you never can. You're
yeah.
sort of stuck.
Yeah, 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 and countries all over the world. You've got an Indian influence or an Indian people. A lot of it, not every single country, but a lot of it will be from the Exodus during the period of the Raj, through whatever
Mm.
means, whether they wanted to go, whether they went for jobs, or whether they went through indentured labor. That's where it came from. That's where those people came from. One of the other things I wanted to mention was that although those people that left in that period, some of them actually went on to fight for those countries that they in the First World War, the countries that they emigrated to. So there were
Right.
examples of Canadian Sikhs who had left during that period, who then joined the Canadian army and fought in the Great War. Similar, there's quite a few
Mm.
Australians. Now, Sikhs, you would not have thought. I mean, I didn't know. There's been Sikh people in Australia since 1860, 1870.
I
A
would
long,
never have
long
thought
time.
that.
No, and many, quite a few. Well, when I say a few, it's only a handful, but they joined the Australian army, and fought in the Great War. Again, similarly in New Zealand, there were people who got as far as New Zealand in the eight,
It
in the
seems like
19th.
patriotism for Sikhs runs quite deep in the sense of like they take such pride in fighting and just
Mm,
being from like a warrior race background. I think that's
mm.
really important to them and they kind
Yeah,
of hold on to it. Maybe it's I don't know what the uptake is in India at the moment, but I doubt it's as high compared to what it used to be. Maybe that's
yeah.
because of newer opportunities where people can become educated and they can go
Mm,
into different fields, or maybe there's just no appetite and they don't like how their current regime is set up within India, where they
mm,
feel suppressed themselves.
mm.
But that's a different topic. But it's interesting to see how people have evolved over time with their thinking and their priorities.
Yeah, yeah, and I think what's important, especially even nowadays, is you mentioned that we're a warrior race. How much do we know about that? I think that's really important. I didn't know about a lot of pre sort of Sikh history before World War One, before Ranjit Singh, and when
Yeah.
you hear about it, but actually when you read the detail of it, you'll understand why the Sikh race
When you read
has
the
been a warrior
detail of
race.
it, it's actually quite heartbreaking
Mm,
because when you sit and read how the Sikhs had this massive reign and how they ruled over so many different areas of the world, and you just see it just shrink and shrink and shrink, and it just
mm,
goes down to the tiniest pocket that's Punjab, and then even that got halved. So it's just it's kind of like a really sad story to sit and
yeah,
read. It makes you quite
yeah,
emotional
yeah,
to just sit and see, wow, there's a catalogue of errors and Sikhs just don't seem to learn from their
mm,
lessons. They
yeah,
always seem to repeat the same behavior again and again.
yeah,
Part of it could be down to pride. I'm not sure about the exact reasons why, but it does become quite hard reading, and you kind
yeah.
of get frustrated. You think like, why couldn't you have just taken the political approach or
Mm.
just been more diplomatic about it instead of being proud?
Yeah, yeah. No, I agree. And in times of partition and stuff, I think a lot of the leaders they were had a colonial mindset, and that, as I said, that's been going on. That had been going on nearly 100 years by then. So they were
Mm,
really under a different way of thinking and stuff like that. And the British, they were very concerned about the Sikh people, the Sikh empire that they'd taken over. You probably heard of Duleep Singh, who
yeah,
was the son of Maharaja
Maharaja
Ranjit Singh.
Rajiti.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Took
wanted
him
to ask
out.
about him.
Yeah,
He was moved, wasn't he? He was
yeah,
sort of taken away, baptized to be Christian,
yeah.
and taken to
Correct.
England. And
That's right.
part of me thinks, did that happen because the British were worried that he would be the heir essentially to the empire
Mm,
that had been built up for him.
yeah.
Um, that was definitely a thing that crossed my mind. And when I was reading about him, he actually baptized himself to be Sikh later on in life, realized that he'd been brainwashed a little bit.
Mm,
Yeah, it's all tough reading to sort of sit
mm.
back and just go through.
Yeah, no, definitely, definitely, and yeah, you're right. They didn't want him to be there. That he could lead an uprising. He was his throne effect essentially, and he probably later found out probably too late in life. He met his mom, and she told him what's been going on and that sort of thing. It's probably a
Yeah, he
bit too
came back
late
to
for him.
India when his mum was dying a couple of
Yeah,
times, and even then, it was under close guard
yeah,
from the
yeah,
British.
yeah. They couldn't let him know, what he'd lost. Um,
Hmm.
One of the other things in terms of the book, his daughter was actually in England at that time, which is Princess
Yeah,
Sophia, and she actually came in to some of the hospitals in the south of England where the Indian soldiers and Sikh soldiers were, and actually met them.
yeah,
And she, spoke Punjabi with them, so she was able to speak. A Sikh soldier writes home to say that she spoke Punjabi, and she gave him
wow,
a pair of socks as a present.
yeah,
I'm not sure
yeah.
what the significance of that was, but that was written in one of
Take
the
it, right?
one of the soldiers wrote that home. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff. I mean, going on at that time. The other thing I wanted to mention was that one of the things that the Sikh soldiers we sort of touched earlier was about knowing anything outside of what they do know, as in the Punjab. So when
Mm,
they went to France, in between fighting, they were able to live with the French people,
right.
and what they were able to see was a scientific advantage and knowledge that the French had. Information, scientific achievement, educational achievement, and not only of the people themselves, the women in particular. So at that
Mm,
time, that was a shock to them, that the women were educated as much as the men were, and the women
wow.
would do all the work because obviously all the men were out fighting,
Yeah.
and they looked after them. The French were actually treated the Sikh soldiers and Indian soldiers in particular very well, and that
Mm,
surprised them because obviously their British counterparts may not have treated them as well.
mm,
And they also met other types of people from all over the world in France. So the Western Front was literally a United Nations of people. They met people as far from places as Vietnam there. African soldiers who were under the French who were under the French colonies, French soldiers themselves. And they saw the way the French lived. They also on tours of Britain. The British liked giving tours when the Indian soldiers came over. They gave them a
mm.
medal, took them around London, showed him lots of places in London, and in England. They were shocked by the splendor. So you can imagine some of these soldiers coming from these dusty villages in the Punjab and being
Yeah.
shown, all this, wealth and splendor of France and England. What they realized was, and this was probably one of the most important things that they brought back with them, was that they were being denied their freedoms. They didn't know that necessarily. They may have thought it, but they didn't know the magnitude of
And
it.
denied their freedoms by who? But by the British or by their
by the
family?
British, by the British.
Right.
So they knew that
Right.
they are being controlled because look at the freedom these people have that we don't have that. So the soldiers actually took a lot of knowledge and information back to the Punjab. I did a talk recently, which you heard,
Hmm.
and there was a man who spoke to me afterwards, and he told me a great story. And he said to me that I talked about this thing about bringing back information from France, and he said to me in his ancestral village that his grandfather had built a school. I said, okay, that's interesting. He goes, he'd built that school because he'd gone to France and seen the difference education had made, and seen the
Wow.
children, and the children were well educated and stuff like that. And he realized that if I want my ancestors and my children and my families to be the same, they need a school as well. So when he came back after fighting in World War One, he built a school, and I was so happy he was saying this thing to me. And he said to me, and you know what's great about it? Because it's still there. 100 years
Yeah.
later, it's still there. And I said, yeah, and here's so it's a perfect example of bringing something which should be normal, having a village school, but they didn't have their village didn't have one. There are probably multiple reasons behind that, but he brought back that knowledge, and brought it back to the Punjab. House
It's
building was
interesting how
another
the
one.
British allowed that as well, because I would have thought they wouldn't have wanted people to get educated to
Yeah.
that level to challenge their views or
Mm.
to understand what's happening in the real world. I thought they would have probably tried to suppress them or maybe send them back out to war of some sort.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things what happened when they came back was a lot of soldiers. They were under the impression that they were heroes, or not necessarily heroes, but they were going to get something for what they'd done. In 1917, the British had promised the Indian people to share power with the Indian people. A lot of people thought that, well, I felt that was a recruitment tactic. That was in 1917. So actually, when you come back from this war, we'll give you some benefits. We might give you some land, we'll give you some gold, or we give you some medals. Not all those, and not all of those were, that all that stuff didn't necessarily happen. So a lot of these soldiers were disillusioned. And also, I think the First World War had a huge impact on the British as well. They realised that the Indian people are becoming more independent. And you think about it, 30 years later, or less than 30 years later, the British had left. So I don't think they probably were going to, sort of get down on people, stopping people from having schools at that point. I think there were more important things to worry about than that.
They probably saw it coming and they thought maybe it was going to happen anyway.
Before the First World War, I would imagine they would have done a bit more, stopping that sort of thing. And they controlled the schools, the major schools, like you've probably heard the Khalsa College.
Khalsa colleges, yeah, they're popped up everywhere, haven't they?
Yeah, the Khalsa College. There was a massive Khalsa College back in the early 20th century or late 19th century, and the British ran that. They ran that. The principal was always be a British person, so they knew how to control things. So the other thing I was going to say was I thought was really important. These disillusioned soldiers came back, and they didn't necessarily get what they thought they would get. Now, these people, one of the other things I should have said before that was we talked about controlling newspapers and the flow of information. The other thing the British did, and in particular to the Sikh people, was that they controlled their religious shrines. So none of the major Sikh religious shrines, Harmandir Sahib, the Golden Temple, some of the other major ones in the Punjab, if not all of them, were all controlled by British appointed managers. So they weren't controlled by, for example, a Sikh. The Kartarpur, the famous one you probably heard of recently, where they created a corridor through to Pakistan. That was again another Gurdwara which was controlled by these. Well, they're called managers. They were called mahants, is the Indian word. And these managers, they were basically just look after money, and the British paid them to do that. So these Sikh soldiers would come back disillusioned, fighting for a cause which they didn't necessarily get what they want. Their religious places are under siege or under control by British appointed managers, and they started realizing that from those freedoms that we discussed earlier, that this isn't right. That something needs to change. So there was two movements which started after that, after the First World War when they returned. One was what they call the Gurdwara Reform Movement, which basically was from 1920 to 1925, and very much influenced by returning soldiers, which was to effectively get back the control of the
Gurdwaras.
of the Sikh of the Gurdwaras. Yeah, that went on for 5 years, and there was a lot of bloodshed. You probably heard the Jaitur morchas and stuff like that, where people every day, thousands of Sikh men and women would just walk to effectively march and rally
to
protest, but not violently, which is actually quite interesting because you think that's probably not the Sikh way. We have lifted the sword, but those people, they just took beats, they just took hits.
But Sikhs are told as well, don't fighting should be the last resort. It shouldn't be the first port of action.
Yeah.
So I can see that.
And eventually, slowly but surely, the British started giving back the Gurdwaras to the Sikh people themselves. Ultimately, with the Golden Temple, and giving back the keys to the treasury and the Golden Temple, and those managers were all thrown out. The other movement was the Indian independence movement, So a lot of ex-Sikh soldiers and Sikhs generally would start thinking about Indian independence because they started to understand nationalism, especially after the First World War. Whereas previously, maybe being an Indian isn't necessarily something they would have thought about.
Yeah.
So the First World War has got a huge number of things that happened because of it. So just after, this is one of the most crazy things, is that only less than 6 months after the end of the First World War, when all these soldiers are returning, and actually a lot of soldiers are still out, still fighting battles, or still can't think of the right word, looking after places for the British, occupying forces. That's the word I'm looking for. They introduced some really terrible legislation, which is called the Rowlatt Acts. Less than 6 months after the end of the First World War, Sikhs and Punjabis were not able to gather in large groups. They were basically not allowed. If they were taken to jail.
Why?
Because they decided that the Punjabi people were basically too rowdy, and we needed new legislation to stop these people in their tracks.
I mean, they are wrong. We are rowdy.
Yeah. I mean, it's a simplification, but that's basically what it was. I mean, there was some crazy things being done, like where you couldn't walk down certain roads. You had to crawl on your body through certain roads. And whether that was actually legislation is a different matter, but that did happen. There's pictures to prove that. And then obviously in April 1919, you think April 1919, end of the World War I was November 1918. So less than 6 months, you had the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in Amritsar. So, and we know some Sikh soldiers, ex-Sikh soldiers were killed there too. And that's where Udham Singh, obviously, who actually had fought in the World War I himself, saw what happened there, and he vowed revenge, didn't he? And on the governor, which he did a few years later. So the World War didn't really end there. It basically moved on. And interestingly, we mentioned a 20% figure. So at the beginning of the war, Sikhs were 20% of the British Army. By the time the end of the war, they were down to 14. So obviously things have changed. I mean, it's not a huge amount, but things have changed.
Still significant, but
still things have changed. A lot of people had left. A lot of Sikhs had left. Left the Punjab. Many were coming back. There was also quite a few what they call conspiracies during the war period as well. There's a particular gentleman called Bhai Randir Singh. He wrote a book called Jail Letters, and just to read that book of what he went through during these war years, where he was allegedly a conspirator to bring down the British, it's absolutely terrible, the kind of things he went through. There's a couple of islands off India called the Andaman Islands. I don't know if you've heard of those.
No.
They were penal colonies, effectively. The British spent troublemakers there. And the horrific conditions they were kept in during the war period. Anybody who effectively raised their head against the British was either hanged or what they called transported for life. So it was a very it's empire at the end of the day. They need control, and if it's through newspapers or legislation or just violence, they're gonna do it, and that's the kind of time period we're talking about, really.
Yeah. Jeez, that is
There's a lot of stuff going on.
No, there was a lot of stuff happening at that time. I think 2 questions to round it out. My first question is: have you actually encountered any pushbacks from Sikhs by covering this topic, and anybody going against your opinion, saying no, Sikhs were pushed and forced into it, etc.? That's the main question, because obviously going back to the statue in Smethwick was vandalized like a week after it was put up, I think. People were saying that statue shouldn't have gone up. So I think there's a lot of underlying tension in the community of Sikhs that sort of don't like how things were depicted or how they were shown to be heroes, when the reality is they feel like they were maybe coerced into it.
I think a lot of people do see them as Sikh soldiers and Indian soldiers at that time as mercenaries, or being used as cannon fodder for the British. I think there is some truth to that. There is a little bit of truth to that, but as I've hopefully I've sort of shared in the podcast, is that it's a hugely nuanced time. It's
complicated, isn't it?
So complicated. I mean, and you'd expect that. To be honest, that was one of the things I wanted to be true, that when I went into this and found out about these things, that it wasn't oh yes, I'll join the army and go and fight this war which I know nothing about. and I'm a volunteer. I was hoping it wasn't that case. That wasn't the case. And the letters, and this is where I think my book is different, is the letters don't lie. You know, these were translations made by the British of these people and what they've been saying. And because my sort of background lies in the sort of analysis of information, as well as quantitative as well as qualitative, and qualitative in this case, I was able to, obviously generate themes from these information.
And you can draw pictures and you can see common recurring.
So we're talking
patterns.
In this book is definitely themes, patterns. This book contains 600 extracts from letters which have been analyzed, every single word. And this transcription took 3.5 years, just transcribing the letters from the record into into a laptop, as it were. And you got to, and it was transcribed in its original form. So there's no editing, there's no changing of language or words. So it's true to life as it could be. So when people say they were mercenaries or cannon fodder, because they don't know the detail, they don't know all the stuff we've been talking about now. They'll know that their uncle lives in Canada or it lives in Vancouver, but they won't know about the Komagata Maru, and things like that. Yeah, and why does my uncle live in Hong Kong? Well, because we had a huge,
probably because of that, really.
We had a huge presence of Sikhs who were policemen in Hong Kong and China during that period. That's why. And it's a very, as we described, it's a very nuanced time. I've never had no kickback. I've never had anybody say to me, well, I don't think what you've written is right, because to be fair, I've only summarized the content of the letters and then presented the letters. So you can't really argue with what's there unless you
can't argue with the stuff that's been written in ink all those years ago. You can interpret it differently. But you can
interpret it differently. And you can't really argue with the summary of what's there in front of you, because it's sort of quite straightforward to a certain extent. These letters show this. And there is some other letters which show the opposite, but overall, this is what they're saying. I mean, the other thing I'd say is, although the letters are a snapshot, there were thousands and thousands and thousands of letters which weren't recorded, but what they did record is the ones they felt was the most interesting.
And there's still some letters that you weren't even able to access. So maybe they could draw a different picture. Who knows? Yeah.
I mean, I transcribed every single letter, which was just over 1,000, because I wanted that fuller picture. So in the archive in the British Library, I transcribed every single letter, and then I extracted the ones that actually made sense and actually I could put into a theme. And I could have used some other ones and created a different theme or another chapter. But actually, these chapters were probably the most interesting, the ones that I did extract. And the other thing I would say is that the voices, I've called it Sikh voices, so they're not just the letters. I found multiple other sources. I used newspapers. Remember we spoke about newspapers earlier? Yeah. Some of the most interesting stuff were where the editors couldn't necessarily write anything anti-British. They did have letters which came into that particular newspaper, which talked about life in the Punjab and things that were going on in the Punjab, written by their readers. They were very interesting, and I've accessed a lot of that. And there are archives all over England with digital archives of those newspapers. So I was able to access those as well. So we're not just talking, and there are other archives where I could access other voices. So not just letters. Letters are the vast majority, but there are other voices which I accessed from different locations across England.
Got it. Okay. My last question to you is, what was the biggest benefit that you felt from writing the book in general? What did you feel at the end of it? Was it a sense of accomplishment, relief? Was it a deeper insight?
Yeah, I think a mixture of all those things, really. I think if I could advise anybody to write a book, I would, or compile a book. In my case, I'd say there was a huge sense of relief when it was finished, and when the final sort of book came through, written and printed and published, it was an amazing feeling. I want to admit, it was probably one of the greatest feelings I've ever had. 6 years of endeavor, from finding an archive, to trying to get licenses for photographs. It was something I'd never thought I'd do, and something I was lucky enough with. And a lot of this is having to meet the right people at the right time. So this isn't something I've done on my own. I unfortunately, one of my greatest sponsors passed away during the period, but he had got me in contact with loads of people. The man on the front of the book happened to be the son of another, somebody who was involved in this project. It was just a load of coincidences.
Wow.
So it was really lucky in many ways. In terms of greater insight, I just hope that people like yourself, people like your listeners, our children, and even our elders, can, if you go, for example, if you go to a gurdwara, many gurdwaras, you'll see the history of our people through our gurus, and then it seems to stop. It stops at the beginning.
It just stops there. There's that massive gap. I was lucky enough that when I went to university, I met a guy who's been on this podcast a few times. His name is Harvey Manda. He runs Noljawani.com. He gave like a lecture series where he told people what happened after the gurus had passed away, and then how we arrived to today, and how the Sikh empire just shrunk, how it all collapsed, where all the different issues aroused, where all the other issues came from, and sort of just drew a picture. And that to me was really powerful, because I didn't know about that. None of my family knew about it really. And hearing that and just having it spoken to you was powerful, and it gave me a sense of closure and a sort of a greater understanding behind common mistakes that tended to happen again and again.
No, most definitely. And you attended these pictures and photographs and galleries and gurdwaras to finish at the end of Ranjit Singh's reign, and then you don't have anything after that. And then but people need to know that if I'm now sitting in Vancouver or South Africa or Australia, why are my people here? How did we get here? What was the reasons? And this book and other books like it, and other that 20th century missing link, as it were, people need to be aware of it. Now, the book is called Heroes, and people say, well, why are they heroes? Well, they went out to fight a war. I mean, this was a kind of war they'd never seen before, and these same soldiers were the same soldiers that came back and got the control back of our gurdwaras, massive part of the Indian independence movement. And so for me, they're heroes, and
that's pretty heroic. I won't lie. Yeah. Well, there we go. Thank you so much for joining me, Fulford, aka
No problem.
Thank you for coming on. And if people wanted to buy the book, where's the best place to get it from? I know you had a certain route you wanted people to take.
I think here's a visual just for people, if you can see that. Is that right?
Yeah.
On Amazon, etc. The paperback is out. If anybody in particular wanted a hardback, they can get it directly from me. So they can contact you, and you could get me in touch.
Yeah, sure. I can pass that through. No problem.
Yeah. Okay, great.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you so much, guys. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with other people. Let them know some thoughts about it, really, and just pass it on and say, I learned this about Sikhs from World War One. Maybe you find it interesting too, and maybe it will stir some conversation, debates, or topics amongst you and your friends. Drop us a like, drop us a comment, let us know your thoughts on the episode, and I'll catch you next week. Cheers.